So we've all heard the promise of the blockchain. Financial systems so efficient that the trade will be the settlement. Medical record systems so efficient that not only can you own your data, you have the ability to walk into an ER for the first time and present a holistic representation of who you are. And then the bigger picture, identity and financial inclusion for the billions around the world that are excluded from traditional markets and industries. That's the promise of the technology. And it is a really far away from where we are right now. Currently, the technology is living within proof of concepts, and it's living within the blockchain enthusiast ecosystem. So I'm Jack Saba. I'm the managing partner of Day One Investments. We are a sector agnostic, blockchain specific seed and Series A venture fund. And we've identified 3 problems from getting where we are to where we want to go. They're regulations, friction of implementation, and scalability. So regulations, this technology is entering very heavily regulated markets in finance, healthcare, insurance, supply chain management, not so regulated, still a tough industry. So regulations need to address the inherent risk in given markets, models, and consumer behaviors. And right now, the blockchain is fundamentally changing the way entities interact. It is creating new risks, getting rid of risks, and therefore should not be regulated in the same way. So with the old regulations, we will stifle innovation. So we need a wait and see approach, but we don't necessarily have that. There's uncertainty around how this technology will be implemented and regulated. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is friction of implementation. The promise of this technology is efficiencies and interactions around with entities and the reduction of trust that's necessary for these entities to interact within an industry. So in order for it to fulfill its promise, it needs to have broad scale implementations. That is really difficult in a financial system as heavily burdened as New York's or around Europe. And the third is scalability. Right now, Bitcoin's network before SegWit could only do 7 transactions per second. Ethereum's 15 per second. Visa does 56,000 transactions per second. So where does that leave us? These are the hurdles to get from where we are to where we want to go. We at Day One Investments have identified emerging markets as the logical bridge to get from where we are to where we want to go. So what we're doing is we're working with regulators in these emerging markets because the inefficiencies that we currently have in developed countries translate to unresolved problems in emerging markets. So regulators are willing to work and open up the markets, understand the risks associated with implementing this technology, and regulate it from there. They are smaller countries with the autonomy and the ability to regulate how they see fit. So we're creating those partnerships. The second is working with private entities because the infrastructure in these emerging markets are not as robust as what we have here. For example, the bond market in Papua New Guinea is pen and paper. That's wild. So with this technology, it's not as though you have to find the partners, get everyone on board, implement and build. There's a green field for innovation. So you have regulators that want to bring in the technology. You have a lack of infrastructure where this can be the first. And you have a scale of transaction volume that's proportionate to the state of development. Here in the United States, we're doing 56,000 transactions per second with Visa. If you go to emerging markets, you're not doing that kind of level of transactions. So what we're doing is creating these partnerships with regulators and private entities, trying to address the problems that they are focused on and what's important to them, identifying what can and cannot be solved by the blockchain, and finding the solutions and investing in the startups, providing the first contracts and the implementations in these markets. A lot of people say that emerging markets are too small for this to really have an impact. You want this technology to be big picture. You want a billion-dollar company. However, the problems that are in a given emerging market tend to transcend emerging markets. So what we have is a truly disruptive technology. We hear disruption all the time. We're going to disrupt Uber. We're going to disrupt Facebook. We're going to disrupt this. They're alluding to disruption theory, but they're not participating in disruption theory. Disruption theory says a given entity has a target market, and that's the big market. And then along the way, there are all these smaller markets that are ignored. And disruption happens when someone creates a value system or a solution for this long tail approach, comes back through the markets, and then displaces the incumbents in the target market. So we think this is the approach for the technology. Start in the markets where there's low friction of implementation, where regulators are willing to bring it in, and where the scale is proportionate. Bring those solutions through other emerging markets with similar problems, and then come back to the United States and Europe once the regulations and the infrastructure is ready. So to date, we have recently established the Pacific Blockchain Center. The Pacific Blockchain Center is working with regulators in Papua New Guinea, private companies in Papua New Guinea to do implementations, and then taking that solution to the other Pacific companies, and then to broader APEC community, and then broader markets from there. We are an $18 million fund doing seed and Series A investments in anything related to the blockchain with a big opportunity. Not all consumer facing, but we're really looking at this as infrastructure for these kinds of opportunities and problems. So that's a little bit about day one, and I would like to open up to questions. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much.
So the biggest regulatory hurdles are two: stifling the innovation because you don't understand it, and not doing anything and allowing it to run wild. So you need to create a framework that welcomes innovation while providing a responsible framework for consumer protection, because we do not yet understand the risk. So you need to play close with the regulators. And there's not yet been a well-established model for how to regulate this technology, because it's not about regulating the protocols, it's about regulating the use cases that are created on top of it. It is a huge competitive advantage for an emerging market to say, hey, this is the framework that we're going to allow for these business models and this technology, because once you open yourself up to innovation, there's not enough markets for these startups to work in. So you're going to start bringing in innovation into your country. So it's going to be a huge competitive advantage for smaller markets to compete on a global market, on a global scale. Yes? I'm very excited about the possibility of ICOs. I think they're an incredibly efficient way to raise capital from future users, but I think we have a lot of lessons to be learned right now. Is it the right way to go to raise $200 million at the seed stage? We're not sure, because a lot of times companies fail for many more reasons than just the ability to have capital. Founder fatigue, improper product market fit, not validating the hypothesis. So I think eventually we will participate in ICOs, and the way we would like to do it is, I digress. The challenge within venture is liquidity and providing returns. So we would like to take equity and a token position, because if you can maintain the tokens, get a 5 or 6x return, provide that to the limited partners, and then hold the equity for the possibility that the company succeeds and has a exit, it's a way to raise the floor of the possibility for returns to limited partners.
Any other questions?
Yes. There are some smaller markets where they've already established coalitions of private companies that want to digitize and move into the future of industries. So where we can create partnerships with already established coalitions like that, those are the opportunities we're open to. In very early talks with one or two, so not too much I can get into. Thank you, guys.